voudrais remercier à mon tour David Scott d'avoir répondu positivement à notre invitation et de nous faire l'honneur d'être parmi nous aujourd'hui. Je ne suis pas sûr que ça va être la manière la plus adéquate d'introduire son travail, ce qu'a déjà fait Christine. Donc c'est pas grave, mais je voudrais ici exposer en quelques minutes et du point de vue de mes propres recherches comment j'ai été intéressé au travail de David Scott, qui me semble essentiel dans ses écrits, dans une perspective qui va donc être tout à fait partielle et qui ne rend pas justice, enfin qui ne prétend pas rendre justice à l'étendue du champ des questionnements couverts par lui. Or il me semble, et c'est pas de la flagornerie, que l'œuvre de David Scott constitue rien de moins que la tentative la plus aboutie de renouvellement et de renouvellement de l'intérieur ou de déplacement, pourrait-on dire, des problématiques postcoloniales depuis le début des années 2000. Si c'est le cas, selon moi, c'est parce qu'elle permet d'aborder sous un angle radicalement nouveau la question de l'histoire et la question du temps historique qui a constitué le cœur de la pensée postcoloniale. La pensée postcoloniale s'était livrée à une profonde critique de l'historicisme, c'est-à-dire des conceptions linéaires ou évolutionnistes d'une histoire qui serait gouvernée par un temps vide et homogène, une histoire dans laquelle l'Europe tenait invariablement le flambeau. Cette vision, elle aurait été adoptée, ça fait partie des critiques postcoloniales aussi, elle aurait été adoptée par une majorité des militants et penseurs anticoloniaux qui donc en seraient restés prisonniers. À cette critique qui reste dépendante d'un espace de problématisation, d'un problem space, c'est ce que j'ai trouvé mieux comme traduction, il y en aura peut-être une autre. Cette critique donc reste dépendante d'un espace de problématisation qui est le nôtre et qu'on projette indûment sur le passé. Et David Scott, lui, substitue une réflexion sur les politiques du temps historique, faisant de ce dernier le temps, non plus seulement un objet de la théorie, mais aussi un sujet et un enjeu qui étaient inscrits au sein même des luttes passées et présentes. David Scott retravaille en particulier le concept de futur passé, forgé par Reinhard Koselleck, pour problématiser, là je vais me permettre de citer non David Scott, mais Gary Wilder dans son ouvrage, à mon sens très scottien, de 2015, Freedom Time, pour penser, je cite, des futurs qui ont été imaginés, mais qui ne se sont jamais produits, des alternatives qui auraient pu avoir lieu, et dont le potentiel émancipateur non réalisé peut aujourd'hui être reconnu et ravivé. Comme on peut le lire dans une recension signée Yarimar Bonilla du dernier livre en date de David Scott sur les contre-coups de la révolution à Grenade, Moments of Adversity, dont a parlé Christine, l'auteur, David Scott, nous invite à provincialiser notre conception du temps historique. C'est-à-dire, et j'interprète très librement ces mots, non pas tant à provincialiser l'histoire européenne, l'histoire occidentale, qu'à provincialiser les débats sur l'histoire qui ont agité la critique postcoloniale elle-même pour en redéfinir fondamentalement les termes, leur donner un nouveau souffle. Provincialiser les débats sur l'histoire, mais aussi, plus généralement, les débats sur l'eurocentrisme lui-même, un eurocentrisme qui non seulement aurait été constitutif, et on le sait bien, des dits savoirs coloniaux, mais qui aurait également grevé les théories européennes de l'émancipation, au premier rang desquelles le marxisme. Dans un récent article sur C.L.R. James, j'en ai appelé à renouveler la critique de l'eurocentrisme, laquelle, dans sa forme actuelle, me semblait avoir atteint ses limites, en tout cas certaines limites. J'avais malheureusement oublié que c'était là une question dont David Scott traitait déjà il y a plus de 10 ans dans son livre Conscripts of Modernity, dont les thèses se déployaient précisément à partir d'un réexamen des Jacobins noirs de James. Car, comme Scott l'affirme, les reproches d'eurocentrisme qui ont été adressés à James sont non pas faux, mais déplacés, car là encore, il renvoie à un espace de problématisation qui n'était pas le sien, qui ne pouvait pas être le sien. Ce que manquent ces critiques, c'est la puissante réflexion de James sur la modernité, une modernité qui, pour Toussaint Louverture et les révolutionnaires haïtiens, et en fait, encore pour James lui-même, n'était pas l'objet d'un choix, mais d'un enrôlement forcé. Ils étaient des conscrits de la modernité, d'où le titre du livre de David Scott. Cette idée aurait donc certainement pu nourrir l'une des thèses que je défends dans cet article, à savoir que pour James, l'enjeu n'était pas de remettre en cause ou de déconstruire le grand récit de la modernité et du progrès, mais de réécrire autrement, depuis les marches, pour y inclure ceux, peuples racisés et colonisés, qui en avaient été jusqu'à présent exclus. Ce qui me paraît fondamental encore, c'est que David Scott relance une question qui, à mon sens, a été peu à peu oubliée au sein de la critique postcoloniale, parce qu'en fin de compte, peut-être, cette question n'est réellement pensable que dans un cadre global, dans un cadre universel, dans une histoire au singulier que les auteurs postcoloniaux ont, pour beaucoup, rejeté. Et je pense ici tout simplement à la question de l'émancipation. Certes, les études subalternes et postcoloniales ont continuellement thématisé les résistances au colonialisme, depuis les révoltes spontanées et généralement défaites jusqu'aux luttes héroïques de libération nationale, mais ceci non sans un désenchantement qui n'a cessé de croître. Si l'émancipation ne reste pas, sinon un objectif clairement défini, du moins un horizon permanent des pensées postcoloniales au sens large, les critiques de l'hégémonie et des savoirs européens risquent de devenir stériles, peut-être même parfois réactionnaires. Or, la centralité de l'objet révolution dans le travail de David Scott, fût-ce, si je peux me permettre, dans une perspective qu'on pourrait qualifier de mélancolique de gauche, une tradition à laquelle Enzo Traverso, que j'utilise car Enzo Traverso vient de lui redonner ses titres de noblesse, enfin, qui court de Walter Benjamin à Daniel Ben Saïd et d'autres. Enfin, c'est dans cette tradition que, voilà, je pense qu'on pourrait inscrire aussi le travail de David Scott. La centralité de l'objet révolution chez lui me semble être le rappel de cette tâche d'une pensée de l'émancipation. Qui plus est, les problématiques soulevées en la matière par David Scott vont bien au-delà du postcolonial et rejoignent certains des questionnements majeurs aujourd'hui au sein des théories critiques et des théories radicales plus largement. Je pense tout particulièrement à ses réflexions sur la tragédie. Tragédie qui, pour citer James, prend toujours place à un moment de rupture entre une époque qui se termine et l'autre qui est sur le point de commencer. Tragédie, c'est le moment où le futur se donne à voir par éclipse, de telle manière que le temps de la tragédie, qui est aussi celui de l'écriture de l'histoire chez James, est fondamentalement le futur antérieur. Ce n'est pas vraiment la manière de faire, mais avant d'enfin donner la parole à David Scott, je voudrais finir sur une note un peu plus critique, ou du moins interrogative, afin, j'espère, de susciter la discussion. Dans Conscript of Modernity, vous insistez sur le rapport entre histoire et art, ou poétique, chez James, et soulignez notamment l'influence de Trotsky et de Michelet. Or, il y a une tradition philosophico-historiographique qui est, me semble-t-il, absente de vos analyses, celle des théories du déclin, incarnée pour James par le déclin de l'Occident de Spengler, avant tout, mais aussi par Toynbee, et dans un style tout à fait différent, par l'histoire de la décadence et de la chute de l'Empire romain de Gibbon. Je conviens que ce n'est peut-être pas la source la plus importante pour l'écriture des Jacobins noirs, mais cette tradition des théories du déclin est néanmoins, de concert avec le matérialisme historique, au fondement de la philosophie de l'histoire de James. James qui opère une traduction révolutionnaire des critiques conservatrices, déclinistes de la civilisation, et qui ne les rejette pas. Et à propos de philosophie de l'histoire, j'ai l'impression que James, au même titre que W.E.B. Du Bois et d'autres, est toujours resté fidèle à l'idée d'une science de l'histoire, une science de l'histoire à même de dévoiler la vérité nue, au singulier, une vérité que l'historiographie bourgeoise, raciste et colonialiste n'aurait cessé de voiler, de recouvrir, de travestir. Or, la pensée postcoloniale a toujours été mal à l'aise avec cette adoption, par ses dits précurseurs, de savoirs, historiographiques ou autres, qui avaient servi à assurer l'hégémonie de l'Occident. Or, je me demande si vos références répétées au travail d'Aiden White, dont la théorie de la narrativité signe, pour le dire vite, le rejet de toute vérité scientifique objective, ne témoignent pas encore du même malaise et ne constituent pas encore une autre manière d'inscrire James dans un espace de problématisation qui n'était pas le sien, et donc de passer sous silence ce qui fait la singularité de sa philosophie de l'histoire et peut-être son actualité, mais une actualité inactuelle, une actualité intempestive. Ouais, c'est une question.
Ah,
Alors peut-être dire que le premier moment, il s'est dédié pour parler de l'histoire, du temps, comme tu as vu dans le programme, et de répondre en même temps si tu le souhaites. Voilà.
D'abord, merci à tous. Comme en Jamaïque, il faut commencer en donnant mes remerciements à tous pour cet honneur. Merci. À les organisateurs et les discutants, merci beaucoup. Merci. Et aussi, il faut donner toutes mes excuses parce que je n'ai pas la capacité à continuer cette discussion en français exactement. Oui. Ce n'est pas possible à discuter mon œuvre en français, c'est justement en anglais. C'est trop compliqué pour moi. Et de temps en temps, oui, je peux comprendre le français, et les questions en français, ce n'est pas possible. Mais pour élaborer mes pensées en français, non, ce n'est pas possible pour moi à ce moment. Et bon, en anglais, excusez-moi. You know, it's interesting to me that where people often begin in thinking about my work is with refashioning futures. But before I come to refashioning futures, I write a book called Formations of Ritual. Formations of Ritual? I mention that because Christine and Didier and Mathieu, I think all three, refer to me as an anthropologist. And there is a great deal of ambiguity about my relationship to anthropology and therefore my relationship to the question of discipline. But in Formations of Ritual, which is a book which is a critique of the relationship between the anthropology of South Asia and colonialist discourse, in particular 19th century missionary colonialist discourse. I am in a dialogue, in effect, with the early members of the group that called itself Subaltern Studies. Partha Chatterjee, Dipesh Chakravarti, Ranaji Puha, etc. And so my relationship in many ways to the questions that concern the critique of colonialism grow less out of post-colonialism, which in many ways is a North American or a North Atlantic academic discourse, and out of people who in many ways are in a discussion that is not entirely framed by the aftermaths of Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Spivak, etc., who constitute in many ways the academic core of what comes to be called post-colonial studies. In many ways, I think of my own work as not being inscribed in post-colonial studies, and that I am in a debate with post-colonial studies just as I am in a debate with the assumptions inside of the anthropology of the Caribbean. No self-respecting anthropologist of the Caribbean recognizes me as a serious participant in the anthropology of the Caribbean. And there are many details about that we can talk about as we proceed, but I think it's important as a way of trying to position, if one wants to position, the work that grows out of, the work that becomes refashioning futures that Christine mentions, and conscripts of modernity, that Mathieu talks about, as well as Omens of Adversity. And those 3 books, interesting to me, Gary Wilder calls a trilogy. I don't know. Refashioning Futures was a critique of anthropology in some, or a way of positioning myself elsewhere than inside of the discipline of anthropology. And that's a really important bit, because my position on that has shifted quite significantly since when I wrote Refashioning Futures to now, the question of discipline. And it's a debate that Stuart Hall and myself had all the time. What is the relationship between cultural studies and discipline, even as cultural studies became itself a kind of discipline? So the question of discipline is very, very important to me. Not necessarily simply the traditional disciplines, however they're understood in France or in the United States or in Britain. Indeed, how they might be understood in the Caribbean. If you're not following me, please let me know. And this, as Christine suggested, should be a dialogue as much as possible across the gaps of language. So that's the first thing that I hope will be on the table. The question of anthropology, indeed connected to that, for me, the question of philosophy, the question of literary studies, the question of history, as the large strategies through which knowledge formations of different sorts takes place, and the way in which the Caribbean is inscribed in those different formations. Part of the reason, quite simply, why I resist and have resisted and still am troubled by all of the assumptions around discipline is that someone like myself comes from a place where disciplines don't grow organically. Disciplines in a place like Jamaica are imposed by a colonial apparatus as a way of constituting knowledges about those places for imperial elsewheres. And so I inherit a structure and am interpolated into a discipline, the epistemological orientation of which is not mine. I don't know if that makes sense to you. I teach in an American department of anthropology, which is very different, which has a very different kind of genealogy and a different kind of tradition than French ethnology and British social anthropology. And in fact, I teach in the department which is the founding department in the United States, the department which was founded by Franz Boas, some of you may know this. And Franz Boas says at one early point, why do we study the primitive? And Franz Boas says we study them so that we can understand us. And I remember as a younger person, when I read that sentence, it wasn't clear to me who they were and who us were. We study them, others than Euro-American civilized people. We Euro-American civilized people study non-Euro-American, not so civilized others, in order to make a hermeneutical return to illuminating the space of us. And therefore that hermeneutical gesture, which is at the center of the epistemology of disciplines like anthropology, was not one that someone like myself could easily inhabit. There's a kind of poetic and hermeneutical or interpretive work that I feel someone like myself has to do in order to inhabit a discipline. So I want to put discipline on the table because I come back to it endlessly, although my position on it has changed quite considerably because I feel defeated in some respect. Similarly, Matthew raises very importantly the term critique. What is critique? You remember Foucault's very famous essay on Kant. What is critique? And for a very long time, up until the day before yesterday, I have thought of myself as a critic. Not so much an anthropologist, but as a critic. And we may come to this later on, but I myself have come to feel increasingly a doubt about the posture of critique. And that is something that I hope that we will think about as we think. One of the texts that Christine, in her very, very generous remarks, didn't mention is a book that will be published next year called Stuart Hall's Voice. And it is a book of mine that grows out of my relationship with Stuart Hall. And what is important for me about my own relationship, which we may come to, dans le troisième moment, je pense.
Une filiation avec Stuart Hall.
Is why it is one might think about supplementing, at least, if not overthrowing, but at least supplementing the posture of criticism with a posture that I might call that of listening. L'écoute. Jean-Luc Nancy has a very interesting set of speculations, as some of you will know much better than me, around this question of l'écoute. So, what we do with these relationships to the objects of our intellectual or artistic engagement, what the posture is that we inscribe in that relationship, is something that is always, for me, open to re-narrativization or re-semanticization, re-questioning. I don't know, how long am I, Christine? Combien de temps? 10 minutes.
Non,
Pas.
comme tu veux. Attends, là je suis un peu perdue. Là.
Une dizaine de minutes, comme ça, après nous on réagit. Il y a des questions.
Voilà.
Exactement.
Oui. Moi je suis une très mauvaise gestionnaire du temps. Donc,
voilà, il y a à peu près 20 minutes jusqu'à la pause. Donc,
voilà.
Une dizaine de minutes, puis après nous on réagira.
Didier, tu es le maître du temps de toute la journée, d'accord?
Okay, so I want to have discipline, the question of critique, and doubts about critique, how those are connected to objects of knowledge are important. And I'm going to come to the themes of this moment, histoire, temps, mémoire, tragédie, by a circular, partly because of some of the ways in which Matthew raises these questions here, but also in that very interesting essay on C.L.R. James, which we will talk about in detail, I hope. Christine, in her remarks, locates me in a particular generational moment, for which I'm very grateful. Because one of the missing terms here, all of these terms here, histoire, temps, mémoire, tragédie, these are all categories of time. There are two categories here that are missing that are of equal importance to me. One is la génération, and the other is le futur. I locate myself systematically now, all the time, inside of a very particular generational moment. And the world appears to me, in particular the world of the Caribbean, and of course the world of the Anglophone Caribbean, because we will come to this when we talk about small acts, what the questions are for me among the Hispanophone, Anglophone, Francophone Caribbean, and why these both intersect and diverge. But I am a child of the Anglophone Caribbean, resolutely a child of the Anglophone. And what I mean by that is I don't use I use the term very deliberately. And therefore, and as a child of the Anglophone Caribbean, and in particular of the Jamaican Anglophone Caribbean, I locate myself as someone who grows up inside of. I leave Jamaica when I'm nearly 20, 19, roughly the same time that Stuart Hall leaves, the same age, for Oxford. But after finishing the University of the West Indies, I leave for graduate school in New York. And it's a very particular conjuncture, to use Stuart Hall's category. It is the moment of the acknowledged collapse of the socialist project in Jamaica. So I lived through my first 19 years, in effect, the enormous hope of post-independence Jamaica, the radicalization of that hope, what I call the radicalization of the Bandung Project in the period 1972 to 1980, the period of when Michael Manley is in power. And in 1980, that collapses. And so constitutively for me, the lived question is what to do with the problem about revolution. What to do with the problem about revolution. I say this in this way because when we come to talk about small acts, it will be very important to me that it is understood that small acts is really for a generation that doesn't similarly hold that view, that is not similarly constituted by the problem of generation. Small acts is formed in many ways for a generation 15 years younger than me, that grows up 20 years younger than me, that grows up in the wake of the 1980s. Now globally, of course, the 1980s on, in the Anglophone world, certainly the era of Thatcher and Reagan are very particular years. But for me and my generation, I live in the wake of, I live always, constantly in the wake of the problem of revolution. And there are lots of people who criticize conscripts of modernity and omens of adversity for what they take to be its conservatism. Tragedy for them is intrinsically a conservative concept. I think that's rubbish, but we can come to that. So the question, so I pivot always around this question of how to think the problem of radical social transformation. How I come at that, how I deconstruct and reconstruct the problem changes, but that I pivot around that. And so the question of futures past that Mathieu mentions, that I derive from Koselleck, is very important, very, very important. Because I think of myself as belonging to a generation that looks back, okay, at an earlier generation looking forward. The generation of C.L.R. James, the generation of Stuart Hall, these are different generations. The generation of Rupert Lewis and Barry Chavans in my immediate world. I look back at that generation looking forward to independence and beyond independence, to socialism, to the kinds of past futurities that earlier generations imagined. And I look back at those earlier generations looking forward to the possibility of me, okay? James, born at the turn of the early years of the 20th century. The people like Walter Rodney or Stuart Hall, or Sylvia Wynter, born in the 1930s. The generation of people like Walter Rodney, born in the 1940s, and I'm born at the end of the 1950s. But that generation looks forward with an anticipation, indeed with a certainty of social transformation. They look forward to the possibility of me inhabiting a post-colonial world radically different from the one they are born in. But I look back at them looking forward to the possibility of me from a place of ruin. That hope has been dashed. The post-colonial, if you like, is at a dead end. This is my view. I'm open to criticism on that, and I can talk about why. And I think that dead end is a fundamental dead end. And by that I mean to use the concept that Mathieu put on the table earlier, the idea of a problem space, which is partly where I derive that view. That the question of what to do in places like the Caribbean is not simply to find new answers to old questions. The question of the nation state as such that was constituted in and through the anti-colonial movement is a moribund question. That is my view. We can argue about that. Not that nations are over. I'm not a post-nationalist in that sense. But that the questions through which the futurity of the post-colonial nation state were constituted by the decolonization movement, by the anti-colonial nationalist movement, those questions are moribund. In other words, the questions through which sovereignty, as understood by the Bandung generation, that is moribund. So, futures past is very important for me, very, very important. What were earlier conceptions of futurity? What conceptions of futurity can I embody? And as a kind of experiment now and again, my view is that we forget the future. We can talk about that. Okay. I very, very briefly then I want to come at the four categories that constitute this moment: history, memory, history, time, memory, and tragedy. And Christine, you'll tell me, or Mathieu, or Didier, you'll tell me when to just shut up. There are any number of things to be said about the question of history, and any number of debates that are critical debates that surround and orient the problematic of history. The relationship between history and archive, the relationship between official and non-official histories, the tropologies of historical narrativization. There are any number of debates that we can enter in around the question of history. But the issue of history and its relationship to time that has particularly interested me in Conscripts of Modernity and in Omens of Adversity in particular is the senses in which, and I'm going to be very brief and simplistic here, and we can open it out in discussion, is the sense in which we, meaning most of us in here of a certain age, as moderns, as we all are, in various formations, we are all moderns in the sense that we have been constructed through a kind of historical consciousness in which large categories of social being, not to say of social analysis, class, race, ethnicity, gender, orient our understanding of the relationship between the past, the present, and the future. And the great modern discourses of social emancipation, whether anti-colonialism or Marxism or second-wave feminism, are shaped by a certain kind of historical consciousness in which we forever lean toward a future to come. We know that however far, there is a future to come. We lean into it. And our pastnesses, or what our pasts can be understood to be, to have been, and what our presents are, is oriented by the dream of that future. It is futurity, in some sense, that shapes the orientation of our historical consciousness. The issue for me about history, as I want to think of it here, is the demise of the certainties embodied in that historical consciousness. And the kinds of concepts that were connected to that, agency, praxis, etc., that drove political movements through a sense of historical consciousness to organize for or to bring forth that future to come. So again, in the back of my mind, of course, is the whole problematic of revolution. My view here, my thinking aloud is that we live in a moment in which that there are elements of the experience of time or of temporality that are no longer captured by, are no longer reducible to our notion of historical consciousness. That there are kinds of time. One that I'm troubling around the edges of is queer temporality, but that's a whole other set of discussions. But that thinking a dimension of temporality that is irreducible to historical consciousness opens up a way of thinking about action that is irreducible to agency. I don't know how exactly to put this in in other language. We can talk about it. Which is partly why the work of Hannah Arendt has become enormously important to me. Because of the way in which she thinks not about history and agency. She's a critic of Hegel, of course, but of the relationship between temporality and action. Hegel, of course, in the phenomenology, thinks about both historical consciousness and agency in some respect, but also about action and time. Because I want to think about a dimension of action in which the large movements, the large social movements that have to do with revolution and futurity are in some ways bracketed, and that one can attend to the minutiae of the conflict of action inside of something like a revolutionary party. Tragedy, to my mind, is the crucial concept that links time and action. Tragedy is a concept that has constitutively to do with conflict and collision, with conflict and contingency. These are questions that Stuart Hall and I quarreled with endlessly because he disagreed with me fundamentally. We can talk about that. So, tragedy, in conscripts of modernity, I'm interested in tragedy and history, of course, quite simply, because there was much that I couldn't see at the time. But part of what I was interested in thinking about Toussaint Louverture and the Saint-Domingue revolt, which became the Haitian Revolution, and I'm interested in that. When does the Saint-Domingue revolt become the Haitian Revolution? It's a question people asked about the French Revolution too, right? And similarly, the question that is being asked and should be asked about the Haitian Revolution, when was it? When will it end? And these are, I think, enormously important historiographical questions that we should debate. But the tragedy of Toussaint, there were many tragedies, but one that I was interested there in conscripts of modernity, is one that lies in the dimension of history, in some sense of historical consciousness, of the relationship between the old and the new. This is the classic conception of what tragedy is, the collision, right? Toussaint is a kind of Hamlet, who grows up in an old world, but is partly constituted by the vision of a new world. Right? He inhabits a kind of interregnum, a kind of historical interregnum, the clash between incommensurable historical periods. And that incommensurability that Toussaint inhabits, Dessalines doesn't inhabit, Christophe doesn't inhabit, but Dessalines does, but Toussaint does. Why? Because Toussaint is the first, this is James's brilliance, that Toussaint, like Hamlet, is an inaugural figure. Hamlet, James thinks of many Marxist intellectuals, think of Hamlet this way, right? As the first modern. He's the first. Shakespeare imagines an individuality that we all in this room can recognize, the sense of hesitation and self-doubt that produces thinking. That self-doubt James implants in Toussaint at that moment when he cannot decide, what the fuck is Napoleon doing? Is he going to acknowledge me or is he not? What should he do? That moment of doubt that constitutes Toussaint is the moment of the modern colonial intellectual. I'm less interested in that now, and certainly less interested in that in Omens of Adversity. In Omens of Adversity, I'm interested in the minutiae of action, the contingency of action, the simple, elementary notion, central to Arendt's The Human Condition, as well as to the phenomenology of beginnings and the contingency and fragility of action, that once action is set in motion, it is impossible to entirely predict how action can end, because of the conflicts of motivations and intentions and possibilities and conditions, the plurality, as Hannah Arendt understood it. So that question is enormously important to me, because the collapse of the Grenada Revolution can be understood as it has been understood by people like Brian and so forth in those large categories of historical consciousness and the problem of democracy, etc. Revolutionary democracy, the dictatorship of the proletariat, etc. But there is another dimension in which these two friends, Bernard Cord and Maurice Bishop, could not resolve a conflict that had emerged between them. And once that conflict had been set in motion, it grew out of proportion in some sense and could not be brought back within the bounds of reason. Kant, Habermas, could not have resolved it for them. We can come back to that memory, the last thing, and then I'll stop. There are lots of things to be said about memory, like there are lots of things to be said about history, and the ways in which Christine has written eloquently about some of these issues around the question of the archive, popular memory, and how to contrast that with official discourses of history, and so on. All of that interests me. But that is not specifically how the question of memory emerges for me. The question of memory emerges for me partly, centrally here, around the question of disenchantment. And futurity. I grew up, like many here of a certain age, in a time when it is the future that is enchanted. And with an enchanted future, the past is negligible in some moral, epistemological sense. The past is to be overcome. The past is what is to be left behind. We are going elsewhere. With the truncation and collapse of futurities, as futurities draw closer and closer to our present, it is in some sense the space of the past that has opened up. The past is a vast vault now, an enchanted vault, which is partly why we live in an age of the preoccupation of trauma. We live in a moment with the preoccupation with the catastrophic. We live in a moment in which disasters obsess us. We live in a time where we are obsessed by haunting. These are categories in which the past and the present weighs like a nightmare, as people have said, right? Like a nightmare. But that is a large shadow that is cast, and that is the space, in some sense, of memory as it interests me. Shall I stop there?
C'est brutal.
Peut-être comme on est déjà 11h15, la pause était prévue à 11h15, on va aller jusqu'à 11h30 pour que les discutants puissent quand même dire des choses. Puis qu'il y a un petit dialogue, et puis on reprendra après. Il y a des éléments en fait un petit peu d'épistémologie qui ont déjà été un petit peu abordés et qui normalement arrivent dans le deuxième moment, mais qui ont déjà été pris parce qu'évidemment dans une pensée il y a beaucoup de choses. Donc peut-être on peut aller jusqu'à 11h30.
Oui,
parce qu'il faut quand même prendre le temps de
et puis on a quand même prévu l'argent pour le repas, non?
Oui, donc si on déborde un peu, c'est pas
ouais.
trop grave.
Peut-être qu'on pourrait commencer par donner la parole à Marie-Jeanne qui a, qui a montré beaucoup d'intérêt pour...
Yes.
Voilà.
I am going to speak in English.
Oh, yes,
Merci
of
beaucoup.
course.
Because I'm a professor of American Studies here, and I read the book, and I was absolutely. I mean, the book I read was Conscripts of Modernity, and I haven't read the others, so of course my focus is going to be my commentary. And I also want to say that the fact that I chose this particular book was not. I didn't have much time, so I chose this particular book for very specific reasons related to my own research. I'm a historian, and I also want to say I'm always intimidated in the presence of philosophers, because as a historian we have this, very prudent and admiring relationship to philosophers. So the reason why I particularly like this book and I could relate to it so easily was that The Black Jacobins was one of my earliest readings in the history of the Atlantic world. And so, of course, if you read your book, and you know the Black Jacobins well, makes it much easier. And I do think that this book could be translated into French, Conscripts of Modernity, because there is a public in France for the Black Jacobins, which has been translated. So it could be a good entry into your work for the French public. So I'm not going to, because we have little time, as far as I know, I would like to say a few things simply from the point of view of a historian of the age of revolutions and the Haitian Revolution. So one thing historians do is to place books in history. And your book was published in 2004, which was the bicentennial of the Haitian Revolution.
And the by Steve.
Yeah. But to me, from my very narrow focus, it means something because, in fact, I didn't know that this book, which is strange in a way, because I read 2004 was the peak in the historical production of the Haitian Revolution, which really started in 1999 and went until 2009. I mean, there was a huge production of the Haitian Revolution by historians. And so this is one question maybe we can debate, is what kind of dialogue do you think you've established with the recent historiography of the Haitian Revolution, which is dominated, I would say, by the perspective of Laurent Dubois, who's written on the Enlightenment and the Haitian Revolution, but in a way which is different from yours, I would say, as far as I understand, is that Laurent Dubois insists that the Haitian Revolution was not the failure of colonial enlightenment, is not melancholic in any way. Laurent Dubois basically says that the Haitian Revolution was a way to test the boundaries of the colonial enlightenment, and is a way for us, and this is of course my own, this is how I understand it, the Haitian Revolution makes it possible for us today to think about how we can conceive of the Enlightenment today. So how do you relate with this type of historical production? Now, another thing, so I haven't seen your thoughts so much mentioned in discussions about the Haitian Revolution, and I think it is really strange because for me this is very helpful. I think that the way this would be my second remark on how the book, your analysis of the book, I think is just great. What you say about tragedy is not in fact so central to the book. But what you say about tragedy, because I was also trained as a literary historian, I think is really important to understand Shakespeare. And in fact, in France, there is this tradition of looking at literary production without the historical context. And I think what you say about Shakespeare, and maybe you're not the only one to say it, but I think is absolutely central. When you read Shakespeare, you should not feel comfortable with it. Because he's writing at this moment which you describe so well, this moment in which we cannot look forward to a progressive future, which is a tragic moment. And I think Shakespeare too. Well, I think doesn't simply apply to Hamlet. I think it applies to quantities of plays in his work. So that was my second remark about tragedy and the romantic. I think that one of the great qualities in this book is your ability to entwine literary analysis with philosophical and social thought. And I think this is what makes the reading, in fact, very... it's a page turner, just like Mathieu's book on Ciel and James, I just read on. And third remark is on the concept of conscripts of modernity, which is not used, as far as I know, in North American historiographical production to talk about the black elite. What distinguishes North American production is the fact that as early as the 18th century, blacks wrote extensively about their experience as slaves, as free people of color. And which is a big difference with the Caribbean and with the French Caribbean and even with other areas. Now, very rarely do you find, or at least I haven't found, because I was writing on it at the time, a reference to the concept of conscript of modernity. And yet, this is such a wonderful angle to enter the African American community in the United States, especially those people who wrote about their experience and who were such conscripts of modernity. This also applies to a project Mathieu and I have been involved in, which was the study of black historians in the United States between the 1850s and the 1950s, which I think can also be looked at from the point of view of conscripts of modernity. These were my three remarks. And of course I know that saying that these various concepts in the book are helpful maybe is a very limited way of looking at it. But to me, it was. So thank you.
Thank you. Laurent, of course, is a friend. And so my remarks are, we disagree, Laurent and myself. I mean, I said earlier that that I am resolutely Anglophone. And partly what I mean by that is that I grew up inside of, as everyone does, debates that are what they are. And for me, as a child of the 1970s, we read the Black Jacobins ourselves waiting for revolution. The Black Jacobins for us was not an academic text. It was part of a revolutionary exercise of how to think about what is to be done. James, who was not then dead, was still an important interlocutor in thinking about the nature of a revolutionary organization. So I read the Black Jacobins every year for many years inside of radical organizations of one sort or another in Jamaica. And so the Black Jacobins for me is inscribed not principally inside of debates about the Haitian Revolution, but is inscribed inside debates about what to do in the Jamaican political present. So, it's many people, so James, although James is ostensibly writing about the Haitian Revolution, James says this much later in a later preface, that he's really writing about an African revolution. And it is only very much later in the famous appendix from Toussaint Louverture to Fidel Castro that James really inscribes a meditation on the history of the Caribbean, meaning for him then the Anglophone Caribbean, into the story of what the Haitian Revolution means to him. And many people, Laurent included, can correct and criticize James for his own historical and ethnographic errors in the Black Jacobins, because the Black Jacobins was not, unlike Laurent's books, an academic text. So, Laurent and I will disagree, I think, around the value of the Enlightenment, the value of liberal principles inside of the Enlightenment, the value of conceptions of reason that have been bequeathed by the Enlightenment, and we will disagree also on how to write history, how to write histories of the present, how to rethink, or what it means to rethink histories. And of course, Laurent and I are inscribed very differently as individuals in these social worlds. Since thinking for me, as principally a Jamaican intellectual, how to think about and what to do with a text like the Black Jacobins is not principally a question of how something like the Haitian Revolution exists in relation to an academic discourse. Am I making sense? Okay, so yes, I agree with you, Marie-Jeanne, that Laurent has a much more optimistic view of how to think about what the Haitian Revolution opens out. Whereas people say, whether it's true or not, I think it's debatable, that I have a much more melancholic. But, I think melancholy is a productive attitude or posture to have. Another aspect, another part of this question here is that how one thinks about the relationship between optimism and pessimism here, or what you think of as how Laurent imagines the value of enlightenment, as opposed to how I imagine the value of enlightenment. Partly perhaps has to do with who he takes his targets to be. So importantly, Laurent wants to quarrel with historians of the French Revolution and of the French Enlightenment, for whom the Haitian Revolution barely exists. It gets 2 pages or a page and a half, or etc. And he wants to show that contrary to that hegemonic conception of enlightenment, there is another. And I think that's enormously important. But I am less interested in quarreling with the great historians of enlightenment, and more interested in thinking about what inside of the question of the post-colony enlightenment has been and can be for rethinking the contemporary dead ends of the post-colonial project. So there's much more to say around that. And much more to say, I think, also about tragedy in relation to this, or tragedy and romance as kind of tropological strategies in thinking about the poetics of history. And what, because I'm not sure, and I keep asking myself about the relationship between tragedy and enlightenment, which I don't feel as though I have a resolved sense of the relationship between enlightenment and what being an intellectual is, the isness of that. And the relationship between the tragic and the particular moment, the nowness of our thinking through the tragic. I am not committed to the view that the tragic, for example, is a new meta key through which to think all history henceforth. I think of the tragic as emerging as a particular way of rethinking the problem space, the particular conjuncture, I was going to say disjuncture, that we now inhabit. So I think of the tragic as itself a contingent strategy for thinking the past in the present. Conscripts. Conscripts. The term, of course, comes from a teacher of mine, Stanley Diamond, who was a very disgruntled anthropologist, died several years ago, who wrote a very important book, I think. Around the question of the primitive and his relation, he has we can talk about him for a very important relationship to the radical Boasian tradition of American anthropologists. In Search of the Primitive was his book. And what interested him was, he has this remark in which he said they were conscripts of Western civilization, not its volunteers. And that contrast between being a volunteer and a conscript of modernity is what he's trying to get at. And another teacher of mine, Talal Asad, whose work some of you may know on religion and the secular and so forth, reformulated that concept around the idea of conscripts of modernity, which I find very, very important. Again, this sense in which one finds oneself in a particular moment, always already conditioned by the circumstances in which one is. That one's sense of possibility is always already shaped by a set of categories and a particular social and political history, and Toussaint's was too. Right? There's much more that could be said about that, but I don't know how much time we have. There's much more that could be said about that, because I think that many people bash C.L.R. James because he celebrates Toussaint's kind of enlightenment, and that's a very complicated story that we can talk about. Thank you very much, Marie and Jean. That's very helpful to me.